The only hard surfaces we see is these thin lines, which are the corridors and angular structures we have on the object.
Imagine standing on the deck of a ship, 300 feet of freezing, pitch-black Baltic water beneath your boots, knowing you're parked directly over something that shouldn't exist. For Dennis Asberg, this isn't a campfire story. It's a weight he's carried since 2011. He's seen the sonar, felt the equipment die in his hands, and touched the impossible geometry of the seafloor. Now, he's speaking out. This isn't just about a rock, it's about the truth hidden in the deep. Geology defied. It all started on a routine treasure hunt. Dennis Asberg and Peter Lindberg, the founders of the Ocean X team, weren't looking for world-altering mysteries. They were looking for champagne. Specifically, they were hunting for vintage spirits and historical artifacts inside old shipwrecks scattered across the Baltic Sea floor. The Baltic is a unique environment, low in salt and lacking the shipworms that eat through wood in the Atlantic, making it a literal time capsule for maritime history. But on June 19, 2011, their sonar pinged back something that didn't look like a wooden hull or a pile of cargo. It looked like a nightmare for every geologist on the planet. As the sonar image slowly rendered on the monitor, the crew went silent. They were looking at a massive, disc-shaped object, roughly 200 feet in diameter, sitting 300 feet below the surface. But it wasn't just the size that stopped their hearts. It was the architecture. This wasn't a jagged reef or a rounded boulder smoothed by millennia of currents. This object had straight lines. It had 90-degree angles. It had what looked like a staircase leading up into the body of the structure. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it wasn't alone. Stretching out behind the object for nearly 1,000 feet was a flat, leveled path, a runway, or a skid mark carved directly into the sea floor, as if this massive weight had been dragged or had skidded across the bottom of the ocean before coming to a final, violent halt. Dennis Asberg describes that moment as a total shift in reality. When you spend your life on the water, you get used to the organic, messy shapes of nature. Nature doesn't usually build in perfect right angles, and it certainly doesn't leave a 985-foot-long flattened trail behind a circular monolith. The object sat perched on a pillar-like base, standing about 25 feet off the seabed, giving it a mushroom-like silhouette that looked more like a fortress or a crashed vessel than a rock formation. The top of the object featured strange raised ridges that formed geometric patterns, circular burn marks or holes that looked intentionally placed. For Asberg, the shock wasn't just in the sight, it was in the scale. We're talking about a structure the size of a Boeing 747, made of a material that looked like cast iron or basalt, but with the finish of a manufactured product. The runway itself is a geological impossibility. If the object moved there, what force on Earth could push a 60-meter-wide solid mass across the seabed with enough friction to level the terrain behind it? The immediate instinct for many was to call it a glacial erratic, a rock moved by a glacier during the last ice age. But glaciers don't leave 90-degree stares. They don't leave perfectly circular structures with soot-like residues on their surface. As the Ocean X team processed the data, they realized they weren't just looking at a weird rock. They were looking at something that challenged the timeline of human history in the region. If this was man-made, it would have to have been built over 14,000 years ago when the Baltic was still dry land, which predates any known civilization capable of such engineering. If it wasn't man-made, then the natural explanation required a series of coincidences so statistically improbable that it felt like a scientific fairy tale. Dennis has spent years defending these initial findings, often against a wall of skepticism from people who haven't seen the raw, unedited sonar files. He talks about the staircase with a particular kind of reverence. He describes it as a series of steps leading to a dark hole, an entrance. When divers finally made it down there, the visibility was horrific. The Baltic is murky, cold, and unforgiving. But even in the gloom, they could feel the texture of the object. It wasn't the rough, porous surface of a sea stone. It felt like something that had been scorched or molded. The deeper they looked, the stranger it got. The object isn't just sitting on the seabed. It seems to be integrated into it in a way that suggests it didn't just fall there. It was either built there or it impacted with such force that it became part of the crust. This wasn't a case of seeing shapes in the clouds. The sonar data was consistent. Every time they passed over it, the same rigid, non-organic geometry stared back at them. Dennis notes that the object has a plate on top that looks like a lid or a hatch. What's really kept Dennis awake at night for over a decade isn't just the what, it's the how. How does a 60-meter wide object end up with a smooth, leveled runway in one of the most heavily trafficked shipping lanes in the world without anyone noticing it before? And why, when they finally found it, did the ocean itself seem to react to their presence? But if it was just a strange rock, why did the equipment start screaming the moment they got close? Electronic warfare or ancient tech? When the Ocean X team first geared up to send divers down to the anomaly, they expected a physical challenge: the cold, the pressure, the lack of visibility. What they didn't expect was a total technological blackout. This is where the story shifts from a weird geological find into something far more unsettling. Dennis Asberg and the crew reported that as soon as the boat was positioned directly over the object, the laws of physics regarding electronics seemed to just glitch out. Imagine you're out in the middle of the sea, miles from the nearest coast, and your lifeline to the world, your satellite phone, simply stops working. The crew reported that the moment they were within a 200-meter radius of the object, the satellite phones went dead. Not no bars or searching for signal, but completely unresponsive. But here's the kicker. As soon as they moved the boat just a few hundred feet away from the site, the phones suddenly chirped back to life. This wasn't a one-time fluke. It happened repeatedly. Every time they crossed that invisible boundary, the tech died. But it wasn't just the phones. The ship's professional-grade sonar equipment, the very tools they used to find the thing, began to experience massive interference. Cameras lowered toward the object would black out or suffer from snow and digital artifacts that made capturing clear footage nearly impossible. Even the diving team's specialized gear wasn't immune. Dennis recalls the frustration of being on the verge of a world-changing discovery, only to have the very eyes of the mission blinded by an invisible force. It's as if the object itself has a defense mechanism, or perhaps it's still on, emitting some kind of electromagnetic pulse or localized field that acts like a jammer. This brings us to the actual material of the anomaly. If this were just a standard piece of granite or sandstone, it wouldn't be causing satellite phones to drop. When the divers finally managed to chip away small samples to bring back to the surface, the mystery only deepened. The samples were sent to scientists, including Volker Bruckert, an associate professor of geology at Stockholm University. While some critics were quick to label the rocks as mere basalt, the analysis of certain fragments showed things that shouldn't be there.
Volcanic rock in the middle of the northern Baltic.
Lab results revealed the presence of limonite and goethite. Now, these are iron oxides, but the way they were formed on these samples was strange. Some researchers pointed out that these materials are often associated with processed metals, or slag, the byproduct of intense heating. Even more bizarre were the traces of manganese and other elements that suggested the material had been subjected to temperatures far beyond what occurs naturally on the seafloor. It looked like the object had been fired or scorched. This lines up with what the divers saw: a dark, soot-like substance covering the surface of the structure. When they tried to wipe the soot away, it wasn't like sea silt. It was like a burnt residue, almost like the carbon scoring you'd see on a heat shield after re-entry. So what are we actually dealing with? If the material is metallic or contains a high concentration of conductive minerals, it could explain some of the magnetic interference. But the dead zone effect, the specific shutting down of electronic devices, suggests something more complex than just a magnetic rock. It suggests a signal. Dennis has mentioned in various interviews that they picked up a 5 Hz signal coming from the area. For reference, 5 Hz is an extremely low frequency, AELF. These kinds of frequencies are actually used by the military to communicate with submarines at great depths because they can penetrate through almost anything. Why would a rock be emitting a controlled, low-frequency pulse? The conspiracy theorists, of course, had a field day. They pointed to the possibility of a Nazi anti-submarine device left over from World War II. The Baltic was a hotbed of secret Nazi testing, and some hypothesized that this was a base for a massive radio jamming station designed to mess with Soviet and British radar. It would explain the circular shape, similar to some radar designs, and the fact that it still jams electronics today. But there's a problem with that theory. The object is huge, and it appears to be far older than the 40s. We're talking about something that looks like it's been fused into the seabed for thousands of years. Then there's the ancient tech angle. Dennis doesn't shy away from the idea that we might be looking at a piece of out-of-place technology. If this object is 14,000 years old, as some of the surrounding sediment suggests, then we are looking at a level of engineering that officially didn't exist back then. A 60-meter wide metallic or stone-clad disc that emits a jamming signal sounds like something out of a pulp sci-fi novel. Yet here it is, sitting at the bottom of the Baltic, making a mockery of our current understanding of history. The frustration for Asberg and the Ocean X team was the lack of mainstream support. When you start talking about electronic interference and mysterious signals, the academic community tends to back away slowly. They want boring, they want predictable. But the Baltic anomaly is neither. It's a physical contradiction. It's a silent, massive structure that's somehow still talking to our electronics in a language we don't understand. Dennis has spent years trying to get a second, more advanced expedition down there, one with shielded electronics and deep-sea ROVs that can withstand whatever field this thing is putting out. He's convinced that the electronic failures weren't an accident. They were a warning. The object is guarding its secrets with a wall of interference that we haven't yet found a way to bridge. We have to ask, is the seafloor hiding a relic of our past, or a visitor from somewhere else? The glacial scar versus the machined hull. If the electronic interference wasn't enough to make your head spin, the physical structure of the anomaly takes the confusion to a whole new level. This is where the scientific community and the Ocean X team really start to butt heads. On one side, you have geologists who look at the Baltic Sea and see a history written in ice. They argue that everything we're seeing, the disk, the pillar, the runway, is simply the result of glacial movement from the last ice age. They call it a glacial erratic, a massive chunk of rock carried by a moving glacier and dropped when the ice melted. But for Dennis Asberg, that explanation feels like trying to explain away a Ferrari by saying it's just a very specific pile of red dust. When you look at the high-resolution sonar and the diver's physical descriptions, the natural argument starts to show some serious cracks. Nature is amazing, but it rarely builds staircases with uniform steps. Dennis has been vocal about the staircase structure he saw, a series of tiered levels that look like they were carved with intent. And then there are the right angles. In nature, you might get a 90-degree break in a crystal or a specific type of mineral, but a 60-meter wide circular structure with internal corridors and sharp geometric rooms? That's not a rock, that's architecture. The divers described the surface of the object as looking like cast concrete. Now, think about that for a second. If this is a natural rock formation, why does it have the texture of a man-made building material? Some of the samples brought up were analyzed and found to contain volcanic rock, which led skeptics to say, aha, it's just an underwater volcano. The problem? There are no active or even dormant volcanoes in that part of the Baltic Sea. The nearest volcanic activity is thousands of miles away. So, how did a massive volcanic plug get shaped into a perfect circle, perched on a pillar, and dropped in a non-volcanic zone? Dennis often points to the soot again. This black, carbon-like layer isn't just a stain, it's a coating. When the team tried to scrape it off, they found glaciers don't burn things. Glaciers are, by definition, freezing. If this object was subjected to temperatures high enough to create a carbonized crust, it happened either during a high-speed impact with the ocean surface or through some kind of industrial process. This is why the crashed craft theory won't go away. The 985-foot runway isn't just a random flat spot. It's a gouge in the Earth that leads directly to the object's current resting position. It looks exactly like what you'd see if a massive, heavy disk skidded across the mud and stopped. There's also the mushrooms theory. Some geologists suggested the pillar the disk sits on is a tectonic pillar, but the Baltic is one of the most tectonically stable regions on the planet. It doesn't just sprout pillars that perfectly support 60-meter-wide disks. And let's talk about the holes. The top of the anomaly has circular holes, about 25 centimeters in diameter, that go deep into the structure. They look like portals or vents. Natural erosion doesn't typically drill perfectly circular, uniform holes into the top of a giant submerged monolith. The debate essentially boils down to two worldviews. One says that if we can't explain it with known geology, we just haven't looked hard enough at the geology yet. The other, which Dennis represents, says that if it looks like a machine, acts like a machine, and ruins your electronics like a machine, maybe it's a machine. He's described seeing corridors inside the structure through the sonar, hollow areas that suggest an interior. If there's an inside, then the glacial theory is officially dead. You don't get hollowed-out centers in glacial erratics. The machined feel of the object is what keeps the public fascinated. It's the stairway to nowhere, and the hatch on top. Dennis has mentioned that during their dives, they found what looked like a collapsed section of the roof, revealing a dark void beneath. It's the ultimate tease, a doorway to an ancient secret, guarded by 300 feet of water and a dead zone of interference. The skeptics call it pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns where none exist, but Asberg argues that when the patterns are this precise, this huge, and this metallic, it's not an illusion, it's a discovery. The more you look at the data, the more you realize that the natural explanations require just as much faith as the more radical ones. To believe this is just a rock, you have to believe that a glacier carved a perfect circle, built a staircase, drilled vents, and then created a 1,000-foot skid mark just for fun. You have to ignore the metal oxides and the electronic jamming. For Dennis, the glacial scar theory is just a convenient rug to sweep the truth under. If the science can't agree, maybe we're looking at the wrong map of history entirely. The Baltic's sunken graveyard. To understand why Dennis Asberg is so certain that the anomaly is something world-changing, you have to understand the theater it's sitting in. The Baltic Sea isn't just a body of water. It's one of the largest archaeological museums on the planet. Because of its unique chemistry, the low salinity, and the lack of the wood-eating Teredo navalis worm, the Baltic preserves history in a way the Atlantic or the Pacific simply can't. Ships that sank 500 years ago often sit on the bottom, looking like they could be sailed today. But the treasures Dennis and the Ocean X team have encountered aren't all made of wood and iron. The Baltic is a graveyard of the unexplained, and the anomaly is just the crown jewel. When Dennis talks about what's hidden on the seafloor, he isn't just talking about the disk. He's talking about a region that seems to have been a hub for high-level activity, both human and otherwise, for millennia. Just a few miles from the anomaly, there are other structures that have left researchers scratching their heads. We're talking about stone monoliths, sunken pavements, and even a 174-foot-long warship named the Mars that was found in nearly perfect condition. But the Mars is a known quantity. The anomaly is a total outlier. It sits in a region of the seafloor that is otherwise relatively flat and featureless, making its massive geometric presence even more jarring. Dennis has spent years mapping these waters, and he's noticed a pattern. There are dead zones all over the Baltic, areas where sonar acts up, or where the magnetism fluctuates wildly. Some experts suggest this is due to the massive amount of unexploded ordnance and chemical weapons dumped in the sea after World War II, over 65,000 tons of it. But Dennis argues that the anomaly predates the World Wars by thousands of years. He points to the fact that the Baltic was once a vast freshwater lake, and before that, a dry valley. If the anomaly was built or landed there 14,000 years ago, it wouldn't have been under 300 300 feet of water. It would have been sitting on a high plateau, overlooking a prehistoric landscape. This context changes everything. If you view the anomaly as a mountain or a shrine built by an unknown civilization before the sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age, the staircase and the entrance start to make a lot more sense. We know that humans were much more advanced than we give them credit for. Just look at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which rewritten our understanding of the Neolithic era. Dennis believes the Baltic anomaly could be the northern version of that story. A massive, monumental structure that was swallowed by the rising tides, preserved in the cold, dark silt of the Baltic. But there's a darker side to the Baltic's history that Dennis has touched on. The sea has been a testing ground for secret technology for over a century. From Nazi V-series rockets launched from Peenemünde to Cold War-era Swedish stealth experiments, the water has hidden a lot of sins. Some skeptics have suggested the anomaly is a lost piece of Soviet or German tech, perhaps a massive acoustic mirror used to detect enemy planes or a prototype for a circular submarine. Yet, when Ocean X brought up samples of the soot and the metal-rich rocks, the age of the sediment covering them suggested they had been there far longer than any 20th century government has existed. The graveyard of the Baltic also includes things that don't show up on sonar. Dennis has often spoken about the feel of the site. There's a psychological weight to being out there. The crew reported feeling a strange sense of unease, a pressure that wasn't just physical. This ties into the reports of local fishermen who, for generations, have avoided certain haunted patches of the sea where their compasses spin in circles and their nets get caught on invisible walls. Dennis isn't just a treasure hunter anymore. He's become a chronicler of these anomalies. He knows that every time he goes down there, he's poking a hornet's nest of history that many people would rather leave undisturbed. The sheer density of strange finds in the Baltic makes the anomaly less of an accident and more of a focal point. Why here? Why this specific geometry? Dennis points out that the Baltic is a bottleneck for the world. Whoever controlled these waters controlled the trade of the North. If you were an ancient civilization, or even something from beyond, the Baltic would be a strategic stronghold. The anomaly, with its 90-degree angles and its runway, looks like a command center. It looks like a place of power that was reclaimed by the ocean. As Dennis looks back on his decades of exploration, he sees the Baltic not as a barrier, but as a protective layer. It's a vault. The silt and the cold have kept the anomaly safe from looters and from the erosive power of the sun and wind, but it's also kept it hidden from the truth. The Baltic's sunken graveyard is full of secrets, but the anomaly is the only one that seems to be alive in its own way, interfering with our tech and challenging our reality. Dennis is convinced that we are barely scratching the surface of what's really down there. So, after all the pressure and the silence, what is Dennis Asberg actually trying to tell us? The weight of the secret. For Dennis Asberg, the Baltic Sea anomaly isn't just a coordinates point on a map. It is a decade-long burden of proof. After years of facing skepticism, funding droughts, and the literal silence of his own equipment, he has reached a point where the truth is no longer about convincing scientists. It's about unloading the weight of what he saw before time runs out. He has often hinted that the most impactful revelations might be so disruptive to our understanding of reality that they shouldn't even be disclosed. This isn't the talk of a man looking for a payday. It's the tone of someone who has stared into an abyss that stared back. The personal toll on the Ocean X team has been immense.
Hi, Dennis Asberg here, Ocean X team. I have today decided to go out with a picture.
They have spent their private savings and relied on public fundraisers just to keep their research afloat. Why? Because the deeper they go, the more the natural rock theory falls apart. Recent reports from the site continue to baffle. The team has recorded temperature anomalies where the water directly over the structure drops towards 0 degrees Celsius, a bizarre phenomenon in a region that should be thermally consistent. They've retrieved biological material and burned debris from a site that has no business hosting either. Dennis has become increasingly vocal about the silent surveillance that has shadowed their work. He describes a world where military forces keep a quiet, constant watch over the Gulf of Bothnia, as if waiting for someone to finally turn the key in a lock they have been guarding for 80 years. He remains haunted by the inner chamber, that dark void beneath the collapsed roof section that they were never able to fully penetrate. To Dennis, that hole represents the difference between a geological curiosity and a smoking gun of non-human or ancient high-tech presence. His final confession energy stems from a simple, frustrating reality. The technology to solve this mystery exists, but the access doesn't. While modern autonomous underwater vehicles, AUV, are mapping glaciers in Antarctica with pinpoint precision, the anomaly remains shrouded in murky water and red tape. Dennis is convinced that if a truly independent, well-funded team with shielded electronics were allowed 48 hours on site, the rock story would vanish overnight. He's not calling it a UFO or a secret weapon anymore. He's calling it a challenge to our patchwork of human assumptions. As he speaks out now, his message is clear. The ocean floor is not the silent, empty desert we've been led to believe. It is a vault of out-of-place artifacts that we are choosing to ignore because they don't fit the narrative of our history. For Dennis Asberg, the Baltic Sea anomaly is the truth that refuses to stay buried. A metallic, geometric anomaly that stands as a testament to a past or a presence that we aren't yet brave enough to face. He has told his story. Now, it's up to the rest of the world to decide if they're ready to look beneath the waves. Do you think the persistent electronic failures at the site are a defensive mechanism of the object itself? Or could there be a more terrestrial, albeit secret, explanation for the dead zone? The Baltic Sea anomaly remains a mirror, reflecting either our greatest scientific mysteries or our deepest curiosities about the unknown. For Dennis Asberg, the mission has evolved from a simple quest for sunken treasure into a profound responsibility to the truth. Whether it's a 14,000-year-old monolithic temple, a relic of secret wartime engineering, or something far more out of place, the physical evidence defies the easy dismissal of the skeptics. We are left with a 200-foot disk that jams electronics, features machined-like staircases, and sits at the end of a 1,000-foot skid mark. If this were found on the surface of Mars, it would be the headline of the century. Because it's at the bottom of our own ocean, it remains a glitch in our narrative. Dennis has laid out his evidence, shared his struggles, and delivered his warning. We are ignoring a physical contradiction sitting right in our own backyard. As the silt settles back over the anomaly, the question isn't just about what is down there, it's about why we are so afraid to find out. The Baltic Sea preserves everything it touches, including the secrets we aren't yet ready to hear. Dennis Asberg has done his part. He's told the truth as he saw it. Now, it's up to the rest of us to decide if we're brave enough to look into the dark water and see what's staring back. Subscribe to the channel for more fascinating discoveries just like this.